Hi, I'm Kathy Burns with the Canton County Cooperative Extension Service.
And I'm Diane Mason with the Boone County Cooperative Extension Service. We're here to share information on food preservation in our series of canning, freezing, and drying foods.
Today we're going to talk to you about home canning. So what is home canning? It's actually the process of preserving food by placing it in a glass jar and heating it sufficiently to kill microorganisms that can cause food spoilage and might cause foodborne illness. We want to do it safely, we want to do it accurately because it can be deadly if it's not done correctly. We certainly don't want that. It's also a method used to preserve food, obviously. I can preserve some fresh produce today and have it good for a year or up to 2 years. We recommend using it within a year, but 2 is okay, just as long as the product has been done correctly. We're going to start by talking about food safety, and it's of course essential that we do everything in a very safe way. We need safe, clean utensils, countertops, jars, lids, everything needs to be washed with hot soapy water to begin with. And of course, starting with your hands. You're going to be washing your hands very often. That's important. You're also going to need to wash the produce that you're going to be canning. In most cases, we're doing produce. You might be doing meats and things like that, but we're going to really address produce today. We want to just wash that with water. You don't need soap, you don't need any other kind of additives. Mostly running cold water will get the process done correctly. If you've got a product that is firm, maybe you're going to do some whole tomatoes, you want to be sure, and you can rub those and just to make sure that they're really clean. That's very essential. If you need to sanitize, if you have maybe cut meat ahead of time, you can do that. It's a very mild bleach solution. We can help you with that if you need it. We want to remind you to use correct, safe, reliable information. We can provide that to you from the Extension office. We're happy to give you those kind of publications. We have publications on general canning and then each individual group, if you're doing fruits, vegetables, meats, things like that. We are happy to provide you with those. You can also get them from the National Center for Food Preservation. They have great books and publications. They have a great website that can help you with info as well. Ball Canning is a reliable source as well, and anything again from the USDA that is connected with Extension and National Center, any of those are great reliable sources. Just be careful of things that you might find on the internet. There's some things that sound great, they may sound a lot simpler, but they're not research based and they're not necessarily safe, and we certainly don't want to do that. We want to have a good product for you to enjoy and to be safe. And also remember that some techniques that maybe your grandmother did or maybe you did back in high school are no longer the correct way to do things. An example I can think of with that is making jams and jellies. When I first learned to make that, we would process the jams and jellies, we would make them on top of the stove, we'd fill our jars, and then we would melt paraffin on top, and that did a little bit of sealing. We now know that that is not a good way to do that kind of canning. That paraffin breaks, and the product has not been heated. So anything that we home can now must be processed, either in a boiling water bath or a pressure canner. The recipes are developed so that there's sufficient time for the heat to penetrate from the outside of that jar into the food and get it to a hot enough temperature for a long enough amount of time to make it safe. So again, just watch and make sure you have a newer recipe to follow. And also be reminded there are some things that you just can't can. If you're having trouble finding a recipe, first of all, call us at the Extension office and we can help you. But some things are just not safe to can at home. You might find them on this shelf at the store, but we just don't have the equipment or the processes to do them safely at home. One that comes to mind is pureed pumpkin. You know, you can buy a nice can of pumpkin, you just can't do that at home, puree it and can it safely. It just takes way too long for the heat to penetrate and get it to a safe temperature. So we can help you can pumpkin chunks that you can puree later, but that's just an example of things that you have to watch. Another thing is salsa recipes. We all have our favorite salsas that we make, and just because you make a good salsa doesn't mean that it's necessarily safe to can. It's all about acidity and different things, and so again, we have some safe, reliable recipes for salsa that can be canned, and we are happy to provide you with those. There are 2 methods of home canning: boiling water bath and pressure canning. Again, follow your recipe to use the type of canning processing that is recommended. Boiling water bath canners, which are basically just big vessels with lots of boiling water, are used with what we would consider high acid foods. Tomatoes, when we acidify them, which we'll talk about in a minute, fruits, pickled products, jams and jellies, things like that. We call those soft spreads. Those are all done in a boiling water bath. They have higher acid, so the acid helps to combat the microorganisms that might grow. And then, of course, the heat from the boiling water. So as you know, water boils at 212 degrees. So whether I boil something for an hour or 10 hours, it's never going to get above 212 degrees. That's just the nature of the beast. So that works, again, well with high acid foods. If I have low acid foods, which would include most vegetables, meats, those kind of products, I need to move to the pressure canner. The way the pressure canner operates, between the pressure and the vacuum, it can get up to 240 degrees. So it can get to a higher temperature that will kill some bacteria that are not killed in the boiling water bath, and also some spores and just some other microorganisms that are a problem because we have a lower acid food that doesn't help combat that. So you will sometimes use your pressure canner. Again, you might have had a recipe that 30 years ago you did in the boiling water bath canner. There are some vegetables that come to mind that I know people used to always do that way. But we are all about pressure canner now. They need to be done that way so that it's good and safe. We don't want to have the risk of botulism, which is the big concern with home canned goods. So now it's time to gather all our equipment so we can get ready and do our canning process. Now, canning can take a long time. There's a lot of hot water. Often there's a lot of ice water, a lot of heat, and a lot of energy. So it helps to have all your equipment gathered to begin with so you're not searching for things and it can't interrupt your canning process. So let's look at these canners a little more closely. I've just got a couple pots here that would be very suitable for using for boiling water bath canner. This is probably the traditional one that most of us are used to seeing. It's a coated enamel. Works great. It's a nice big pot that can hold a lot of product. Next to it is just a smaller canner I have for doing smaller amounts. It's a big pot. It has a rack in it. Got to have some kind of rack. There's a large rack in this one. The smaller one that fits in here. You might even have a rack that is flat. Just anything to keep the jars off the bottom of the canner. We just don't want those jar bottoms right against the bottom of the canner because of all that intense heat. So that's why we have those. It kind of also helps with getting your jars in and out of there because they're going to be hot. You don't have to have a special boiling water bath canner as long as you have a pot with which you can put your jars in and allow the water to boil 1 to 2 inches above. That will work. And again, have some kind of rack in the bottom to keep those safe. Boiling water bath. So what that does, of course, is it transfers heat to the jars through the boiling water. And so there are very precise times for different products, and they might differ even among the same product. You might have tomato pieces that have one time. You might have whole tomatoes that have another time. So check and make sure you're using the correct one. We mentioned the pressure canner. This is our pressure canner. This is a dial gauge pressure canner. You might also have a weighted gauge. You might, either one will work fine. They just help you indicate the poundage of pressure that is used when you conduct your recipe. They also have a rack in the bottom. They're made from a heavy aluminum. They're kind of heavy to begin with, so you gotta have your muscles out when you do this because once you get this filled with jars, you have to be able to lift it. That's another thing about canning. It's nice to do with another family member because there is a lot of work involved and it is just a nice way, and sometimes you need somebody to help you out, maybe move your muscles. So these again are for our lower acid products because when we get this pressure canner going, it will get to 240 degrees and be a lot safer. The other one I have here is something that might be a little bit newer to some of you. This is called an atmospheric steam canner. So these have not been around as for very long, but what they do, they are also used with higher acid products. So again, I cannot do vegetables or meats in here because with those products, I would need to do them under pressure. Because this again is just working off of boiling water. What it does is it has a smaller amount of water in the bottom, and it works off the steam that goes through the canner, and it heats the product. Now there's it's not a real simple process. You can't just take a regular pot and do the same thing. You saw that this one has an indicator on the dial, and when I heat my product in here with just a few inches of water in the bottom, I also have a rack and I put my jars on top. I put this on and I have to wait till my indicator gets to the zone of which it needs to be, and then I need to start timing. And of course it has to stay there the whole time. If it drops down, then I'm not doing this sufficiently. So they do save water. Again, it's the same products that you would do in a boiling water bath canner. The times are the same, but you just have to make sure that you have sufficient steam that stays as long as you need it for. These can only go for no more than 45 minutes because of the water evaporation. And if you're very vigorously boiling your water, it might go a lot quicker than that. So again, read the directions and just make sure you're doing them correctly. But either of these will work for high acid products, this for low acid products. There's lots of other equipment that you're going to need when you do your home canning. First are your jars. So you want to use a canning jar. No leftover product jars that you might have around that even fit the lids. That doesn't matter. They're still not suitable. These have been processed in a way that they can take that intense heat, and they can be used year after year after year. But you need to inspect them. Even if I get a new box of jars, or if I'm pulling them out of the attic or the garage, you want to inspect them. Make sure there's no little nicks or little scratches or even like a hairline crack in here, because not only could that break when you were processing, but it can interfere with the seal of the jar. So we want to make sure they're nice and smooth. Of course, they'll be nice and clean, and again, those can be used over and over. This is what we would call a wide mouth jar, and this is a regular mouth jar. It's a personal preference. These are both pint jars. It's just what you like. So to go along with those jars, we need some lids, and we want you to use these two-piece lids. They consist of what we would call some people call this the flat, or just the lid itself that fits onto the jar. These have to be changed every time you use them. These are not reusable. So you'll use it to can, you'll open your can, and then you discard it. But on top of that is the screw band. These can be used year after year after year. You just have to watch and make sure they don't get rust on them, because that can interfere with your processing as well. So those fit together. And so you can find them for the regular mouth, you can find them for the wide mouth jars as well. When you buy new canning jars, they will come with the jar, the lid, and the screw band. But after that, then you can just buy the flats or the lids themselves, because that's all you'll need to redo unless you need to replace some jars. So those are our jars that we're going to use. Then we need all these other things to help make the whole process a little bit easier. I'm just going to go around. We're going to start with paper towels. You're going to use paper towels when you wipe off the rims. You just are going to use paper towels anyway in general cleaning. You need to have some hot pads, of course, because you're going to might be pulling off a hot lid or moving a hot pan. Lots of nice clean towels that are ready to go. You'll need some kind of rack, or you could use towels, and this is used for resting our canned goods when we take them out of the canner and we're going to have them cool, and then we're going to leave them alone. Just getting them on a little rack can raise them a little bit and help them to cool a little bit more efficiently. So that's what that's for. This is what you would call a jar lifter. We got to have this when we can, whether we're boiling water bath canning or pressure canning, because this is used to lift the product in and out of the canner. Note that it has a coated edge and it has kind of a handle edge, and so this is the area that is a little more grippy. It will grip your jar. You don't want to grip it around the ring because it can easily slip. You want to go below that and just lift your product in and out of the canner. You're going to want some kind of ladle just for filling your jars. And along with that is a funnel. You can do it without a funnel, but it sure makes life a lot easier. What that's for, as you can imagine, I can put that on my jar and then just fill it. And then I can lift it gradually. There might be some product that falls back in, and then get ready to put my lid on. We know that when we're canning, we've got to check for head space. Head space is the amount of space that's between the top of the product and the very top of the jar. So head space can vary, and it does vary for different products. For tomatoes, it's a ½ an inch. For these carrots, it's 1 inch, and you can probably see there's a difference in that. You don't want to get your tape measure out, right? So there is a tool to make your life easier for doing that. And that's what this is for. It has little 1/4 inch increments on it. So what I can do is rest it on the top rim of my jar and measure. So if, for example, my product says I need a ½ an inch of headspace, I'll take it down 2 steps, that's what I kind of call it, and measure, and the product should just come to the very top of that indicator. The other thing that you're going to use is what we call an air bubble freer. Now you can use the bottom of this, or I like to just keep a plastic cutlery knife around. I don't want to use metal because I don't want a chance nicking my jar. But what that's for is after I fill my jar, let's say I'm filling it with tomatoes, and I put it in there, there can be an air pocket in there. So after you fill your jar, you just kind of go around the inside with that. And that's what that is for. This you might find in some canning equipment. Most of us who've been canning for a while have these, but you know what? We don't need them anymore for canning. This is a magnet on the end of this wand, and that is used to be used for picking up these lids, because in the past it was recommended on the jar package that you heat these lids before you used them. So we would have a small pot that we would just put some warm water, never boiling, just simmering water, and we would put those lids in there, and then as we got ready to use them after we filled our jars, we would get in here and lift it with that. But you don't need that anymore. So it's got a little magnet on it. You can use it for other things around the house. The last thing I have here, just a couple other things, is another pot. This is just for extra water. In the boiling water process, sometimes when you boil a long time, that water, of course, will evaporate and the level can get down a little too far. So it's good to keep a pot of really hot water on your stove while you're processing, so you can always lift the lid and pour more water in should you need to. And the last thing is just another example of a rack. If you don't have a rack that came in your pot, this is actually just a cooling rack, but it will fit in some of the pots that I have. So it's just another thing that you can do if you don't have if your pot doesn't have a rack in it. Okay, just a couple other reminders. Your recipes might talk about altitude. Altitude is not an issue in Kentucky. We are primarily below 1,000 feet, so the timing in the recipes that you will find is correct. You don't need to do any kind of adjustments with that. Also, just going to give you a final reminder to use good product. We're doing a lot of processing, we're doing a lot of work, so we want to start with a good quality product. If our product is starting to go bad, it's just not the best, it's not going to get any better once I process it and put it in the jar and let it sit for 6 months or a year. So start with good quality product, don't waste your time. And again, enjoy this day, it's a good time. Some people find it very therapeutic. It's also good family time. You can always give people little jobs to help you with this. And you will certainly enjoy the fruits of your labor later on, and you'll appreciate the hard work you did, and I think your family will enjoy it. So good luck. Hi, at this point we are going to process some home canned tomatoes using the boiling water bath method. So I have done some ahead of time that I wanted to share with you. You can can whole tomatoes. You can do pieces, you can do them in water, you can do them in juice, but just be sure and check for a reliable recipe. We recommend that you get your recipes from us. We are happy to formulate those for you and send them out for you. We have publications from the UK Extension Service on home canning, and we have specific ones for different types of food, such as tomatoes. We also recommend that you use USDA, the National Center for Food Preservation, and the Ball Blue Book. Those are all great sources of good, reliable, safe information. Just don't go out looking around on the internet, because sometimes you're going to find some things that aren't so safe. And that's what we want. We want to have a good product that is well preserved, shelf stable, but safe and done correctly. So today I'm going to hot pack these tomatoes. You could cold pack. Cold pack is just taking the product, taking something like these tomatoes that I have peeled ahead of time, either the whole or the pieces, and filling your jar, putting water or juice or whatever you want in there, and then processing. But again, we're going to hot pack them because we can get a nice good product in there that's ready to go. You do need to check on your recipes and make sure that you're using correct timing, because the time to process whole tomatoes is different than it is for pieces. The time for juice is different from water, so just be sure and check that. So today I have Roma tomatoes. I like to use Roma tomatoes because they're nice, meaty, and they make a nice canned product, but any kind of tomato will work for this process. It will be the same instructions. You can mix them up. You can have a variety of tomatoes in there, but you do just need to follow the instructions that we're going to share with you. So I want to peel these tomatoes first because I don't want the peelings in the jar because they're going to roll up and be very unattractive in my product, and I don't want that. I'm going to go ahead and remove them, and then they'll be ready to use for chili or lasagna or any other kind of recipe. So the easiest way to do that is to first cut a little X in the blossom end of your tomato. So just a real simple little X, that's all it takes. And what that does is it just helps start the peeling process of the tomato. So I'm going to take our tomatoes then. I've gone ahead and cut the rest of these already. And over here I have some hot water. So I'm going to remove my lid. It really doesn't need to be boiling, just a nice simmer. We are good. Turn this down just a little. There we go. And since it is hot water, I'm going to put this on my big spoon here, and I'm going to set a few of these in here. Don't overload your pot. If you put more than, I don't know, 4 or 5 or so in there, it's going to, of course, lower the temperature of the pot, and the tomatoes will take longer to start the peeling process. And we don't want them cooked. We just want them to start with the skin removal. So you just kind of leave those in there for a few minutes. Nearby, you also want to have a bowl of ice water, because again, we don't want these to cook. So what we're doing is we're putting these in this hot water for, oh gosh, 30 to 60 seconds, just depending. You can just kind of keep an eye on it. And then immediately putting it in the ice water, just for long enough to cool it off, and then we can bring them over and peel them. So what you're looking for is the skin will start to split, and especially that area where we cut it, it will start to really show there, so that makes it just a little bit easier. Let's see. Sometimes I get a little over anxious. You can pull them up and see if they're starting to peel. They should easily. So you can probably see that that's just coming off real easily. That's great. That's all I need. So I'm going to put it right in the ice water. I'm going to go ahead and remove all these because they went in about the same time. And then I can start my next batch. So at this point, just got to get in there and take and pull that skin right off. And like I said, by putting it in that hot water and then that ice water, that peels really nicely, very easy. If you're a composter, this is great stuff that you'll have for your compost pile. I'm just going to cut this off. And at this point, what I would do if I had a big core, this one just has a very small core, I would go ahead and remove that. And if I had some bad pieces, I would remove that as well. So when we start this process, we are going to start with some of the tomatoes cut into small pieces. I went ahead and did these earlier because we're going to put that in our pot to heat, and we want to start our juice forming, and we need juice to can them and just start the process, because if I would put this tomato in the pot, it would just start to burn, and I don't want that to happen. So since I already have some starter ones ready, the rest of these tomatoes, I'm just going to take them and I'm going to quarter them. That way I will have some bigger pieces in my finished product that I can again use. I can always cut them down later if I want them smaller, but it gives me a nice meaty jar full of tomatoes. So we're going to finish the rest of these tomatoes, and then we're going to cook them for the hot pack. So I have peeled all of my tomatoes and I have quartered them and I've started the process. So in this pot are those little diced up tomatoes that I had just to kind of start my juice process. And then I took these quartered tomatoes and I'm going to gradually add them to my pot. I can add a whole bunch at a time, but I don't want to put them all in because this whole pot is going to have to end up boiling. So we're going to put them in there and get them going. After they're all in there, the pot will return to boiling, and then we have to boil them 5 minutes. At that point, we'll be ready to fill our jars. There's a couple things we need to remember before we can tomatoes. Tomatoes all need to be acidified. When you buy tomatoes in the store, at the market, when you grow them yourself, they all have different levels of acidity. And we need a standard acidity when we process them. So we are going to acidify each jar so that we know that we get a nice, safe product. So first of all, I have my canning jar here. You want to be sure and use a canning jar. They are made to go through the process of the heating, and they're tempered glass and they can be used over and over, but we want to have a good canning jar. No old mayonnaise jars at this point. Canning jar, and we use a 2-piece lid. We've got the lid and we've got the screw band. The jars and the screw bands can be used year after year if you want to. The lids have only one-time use on them. So for my jar, I'm doing pints today. I'm using a wide mouth jar because I like a wide mouth. You can use a regular mouth, that's fine too. But to each jar of tomatoes, I need to add 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. We have to use bottled lemon juice. Can't use fresh lemon juice, even though you probably want to, because the acidity in bottled lemon juice is standard. We don't know, again, the lemons that we get at different times of the year have different levels of acidity. So we want to be sure and use bottled lemon juice product. You can also use vinegar. You can also use citric acid. It just depends on what you like. Vinegar does impart a flavor that you may not like. And a lot of us just don't have citric acid. But anyway, most of us have lemon juice and that's what we've got. Tablespoon per pint. Salt is optional. This is a canning salt product. You could use your home iodized salt, but iodized salt and just table salt have an anti-caking agent in them, and so sometimes that can make your product cloudy. Canning salt does not. That's up to you. I'm not going to put them in because I don't want to. I want my tomatoes just to be tomatoes and ready to go for any kind of recipe. I can always add more salt later. So our tomatoes have cooked. They're 5 minutes. They boiled after we got them all in there together, and we are ready to fill our jars. I do have the lemon juice in all my jars. I went ahead and did that. You can add the lemon juice at the end, but I never want to forget it, so it's very important. So I usually put it in my jars first. So I have my jar, I have my funnel, and at this point I'm just going to take that hot mixture. Again, we're hot packing, and I'm going to fill my jars. I like to get a lot of the kind of meat, you know, you might as well. There's a lot of good juice in here too that I want, but I want to fill these up nicely with our tomatoes. So we started out with, if you recall, the little pieces and then the quarters, and of course the quarters have broken down a little bit. That's okay, we needed them too, but at least I've got some really nice tomatoes now. So here's my jar full. I've got to do a couple other things to it. So I want to level this out, because I have to worry about headspace. Now, one of the things you need to do is to go around the inside of the jar. I like to just use an inexpensive plastic knife, or you can use these kind of bubble freers, they call them. You can buy those in your canning supply section. But you just want to go around the inside of the jar, because sometimes you get air bubbles down in here. And then what happens is after your product is canned, the level is way down. We certainly don't want that to happen. So we just kind of go in there, go around the inside. Don't use a metal knife. We don't want to worry about nicking or kind of hitting our jar, so plastic always works. Now I've got to check my headspace. So headspace is really important because it keeps your product at best quality and keeps the product processed correctly to go along with all the times. So different foods have different headspaces. For tomatoes and most fruits, it's a 1/2 inch. So you might be good at figuring that out, but for most of us, we want to check it. And this is a tool, again, you can buy this in your canning supply section of your store, and it has these little 1/4-inch increments on it, kind of like a little step ladder. And 1/2 inch, I want to go up 2. So what I'm going to do is go to the second step, and I'm going to go around the lid of my jar, and I'm right there. If I think, oh gosh, you know, am I a little bit low? Am I a little bit high? If you think you're a little low, you can always add a couple more spoonfuls of liquid. If you're a little high, you can get in here and remove some. But I've done this a couple times, and that's pretty good. So I'm ready to put my lid on. I've got to do one more thing. I've got to wipe the rim of the jar, because as I put those tomatoes in, I could have a stray seed, I just might have some juice, and it might interfere with the gelling of the lid, and we certainly don't want that to happen. So we mentioned we have our 2-piece lids. So this has the sealing compound. We're going to put that side down. Now in the past, if you had canned before, you might have been used to warming those lids. It used to be a recommendation from the canning company. It is no longer. So it can just be clean, soapy water, wash, it's ready to go. So you'll put that on, and then we're going to put our screw band on. We're going to put those on what we call finger tight. So I turn it till I start to get resistance, and then I stop. I don't want to over tighten it. It could interfere with the lid and the whole canning process. We've seen them buckle before if they've been way too tight. So we want to just do that and let it go. I'm going to go ahead and fill this last one. I'm just using a really small 3-pot canner that I have. So when you look at boiling water bath canners, you can buy big canners. This one over here, this big blue, people kind of call them granite canners. They've been around a long time. They work really well. They're going to do great for canning. Just need a big pot. You need something that will allow your product to go into the canner and have water to boil 1 to 2 inches above the jars. So even if you have a big stock pot at home, that's fine too. But what you do need is a rack. So a lot of these come with racks. This one comes with a big rack. The little one I have, I bought another rack. It was just a regular stock pot. I found a rack to fit. You can also just use like a cooling rack, some kind of rack. We don't want the jars hitting the bottom of the pan. We don't want to risk some breakage. So I've gone around the top, the inside of this jar. I'm going to wipe this off as well and put my lid on. So in my small pot over here, I have my water, not boiling, but I do have it hot. It's a hot pack, so I want to put it in a hot water. Even a cold pack, you'll put in hot water, but not quite as hot. Well, we have the guidelines for you. This is we want this to be about 180 degrees. Of course, boiling is 212. So we're going to put these jars. This one has a rack, like I said, that has sides that I can fill and put it up and down like that. And we need to get an important piece. This is called the jar lifter. And you really do need something like this. They're not very expensive. And they have 2 sides to them. The coated side is what you want to use to grab your jar, and then you have your handles here. Be careful how you grab your jar. Don't grab it around here, around the ring, because it gets slippery. Go down below it to grab your jar. You want to hold it straight. A lot of times when we're putting jars in or removing them, we have a tendency to kind of tip them. We don't want to do that, because remember, we want that jar to seal correctly. So we need to not chance tomatoes or tomato seeds or any other food getting caught between the lid and the rim of the jar. So I'm just going to set these in here. So we're going to get all of our jars into the canner. Again, I'm just doing a small amount. Most people, if they're canning, are going to be doing a lot more than that, but that's all right. I'm going to put this in here. With this canner, then I will just take our rack and set it in there. At this point, I'm going to put my canner on high. I need to have a rolling boil to do this process. So it's going to take a few minutes I will go ahead and put the lid on. I'm going to raise this up all the way, put the lid on it. And it's kind of simmering right now, but that's not what we want. We need a rolling boil. Until we get a rolling boil do we start timing. So at this point we just wait. You know how it is about watching water boil. Just wait a few minutes and then we start our timing. During the processing time, you might have some loss of water due to the constant boiling. So if you do, it's very helpful to keep an extra pot of hot water or a tea kettle or something close by that has hot water in case you need to add it during the processing time. So in here I have some hot water. I'm just going to add it into my pot here. Try not to pour it directly onto the jars themselves, but just top it off. And then I know I want to have and maintain at least 1 inch to 1 inch to 2 inches of water over the top of the jars. All right, our 35 minutes are up. Our tomatoes have been full rolling boil for all those 35 minutes. So at this point I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to remove the lid. Be very careful, of course, because you've got a lot of hot water. And then I'm going to let them sit in the canner an additional 5 minutes. That's a recommendation from the lid company. They have found that they had better results with the lid sealing correctly if they sat in there 5 minutes. So just 5 more minutes. So our jars have been sitting in the hot water for 5 minutes, so at this time I'm ready to remove them. I have just a cooling rack here. I put a towel underneath it. You can use just towels, but the towel in the cooling rack is really nice because it helps just to start the cooling process a little bit more. So with this particular canner and rack, I have these little shoulders on my rack that I can use to help me get the jars out. You might just have a flat rack in the bottom, that's fine. You're just going to get a hold of your jars. Again, straight in, straight out. There's going to be water on the lids because we've had them in boiling water. And it's really tempting to turn that jar a little bit to get the water off. But remember, that seal is still hot. Everything is still hot. We don't want to chance any food getting in there. So we're just doing straight in and straight out. And there's our jars. Now I have to leave them alone. The rings might be a little bit loose. Don't touch them, just let them go, and they need to sit at least 12 hours so that they cool correctly, and it helps guarantee your seal.
Okay, now that your canning is complete, I want to cover a few tips for post-canning activity. Number one, you may find that right after you do can, and this jar is still a little bit warm, you'll find that some of your items are sort of floating in the jar, and that's normal. After it sits for its required 12 to 24 hours, those items will drop down and be under the water if there's still plenty of water in the jar. After they've sat for 12 to 24 hours, you'll have cool jars and you'll be able to handle them. The first thing you want to do is to remove the ring and take a look at your jar. You can look at your jar and see how high your water level is and if your product is still under the water. If it's not, it's okay. Don't take the lid off and try to add water or do anything. It just means that if I have this jar and another one where the water level's okay, I would use this jar first. If it's really, really low, again, I would just use it first, and I'd probably try to use it within maybe a month or so. It's just going to deteriorate faster. After I take the ring off, I just want to take a nice wet towel and wipe my jar off, clean the top off, and that just gets rid of any sediment or anything that might be on the jar that would attract bugs in storage. So I'm going to wipe it off. I always want to label my jar. I usually either use a permanent marker, or you can buy stickers that you can write the name of the item and the date that it was canned, because after you do this for a few years, you may forget when you did things. So always date your jar. We do recommend that you use the product within 1 year, no more than 2 years. And as it's sitting on the shelf, you want to store it in a cool, dry place, not in the direct sunlight, and you can line your jars up. If you'll notice, this particular jar, this is looks like a peach jam or a peach jelly, a peach jam. You'll see that the top part of this jam is starting to darken. This jam is over 1 year old, and it's somewhat normal for that to happen, but it's not normal for it to happen at this rate. And the reason, one of the reasons this is starting to darken is that the head space of this particular jar was incorrect. For jams and jellies, the head space is 1/4 of an inch. And this one looks like it maybe was about an inch or a little bit more. So maybe it was the end of the run and they didn't want to not can something. It's better to go ahead and eat that product than to can a partial jar. You can't can partial jars and get a good quality product. You won't get all of the air exhausted out of the jar. So that's an example of something to be concerned about. If I saw this on my shelf, I would discard this jar. I would not use this because I don't know how far down the product has gone to deteriorate. Another thing, sometimes we wonder if something didn't seal. That's another thing, is you can check the seal on this. If I push down on this, this lid should not move up and down. I should not be able to pop the lid off just by using my fingers. If I can, it means that it didn't seal and I need to, I have 24 hours to either reprocess the food or do something with it. So I have several choices. I can reprocess the food, and by reprocessing, I mean I take it out of this jar, I replace the lid, I bring it back up to temperature, I repack it, and I reprocess it exactly like I would have with the normal product. So if I processed it for 20 minutes, it has to be processed again for 20 minutes. That means it's going to be really overcooked. I can empty it out of this jar into a freezer container and put it in the freezer for storage, or I can put it in the refrigerator and use it within the next couple of days. So I do have some options. If I have a lot of jars that didn't seal, I'm going to look to myself to figure out what I did wrong. Were my lids new lids? Did I use the proper process? Did I process the proper amount of time? Did I wipe the rim of the jar before I put the lid on? Because sometimes you can get little pieces of food or salt. Did I check the jar before I used it to make sure there weren't any nicks or cracks in the top of in the rim of the jar? All of those can affect whether my jar seals or not. So always look to yourself. Also, if I have water that's low, if I have a low water line, like on the green beans I had, maybe it's because I didn't let the pressure canner come down to pressure on its own. Maybe I had the pressure way beyond the 11 pounds of pressure, 10 or 11 pounds of pressure that was called for in my pressure canner. There are several reasons why I might pull liquid out of a jar. Remember that when the jar is in the canner, it has not yet sealed. It does not seal until it comes out of the canner and has time to sit for 12 to 24 hours. So I'm going to put these up on my shelf, and I'm going to enjoy the fruits of my labor for the next year. And as I'm thinking about next year for canning, I will plant and be prepared with my jars and everything before I get started. So I encourage you to can quality produce, have all of the equipment that you need before you get started, and then follow the recommended recipes that have been research-based and from a quality source, whether it's the Ball Blue Book, the Cooperative Extension Service, the Center for Home Food Preservation. We always encourage people to use those resources for canning. And enjoy, because this in January is yummy, yummy, yummy.
We hope you find all this information to be helpful. We've given you a lot of details, but we know sometimes there can still be questions. So feel free to call us or email us, and we're happy to hear from you. Happy preserving.